So I'm sure we all saw the results of the US election. Right. Obviously, I'm not trying to give y'all a civic lesson, but I honestly feel like a lot of people either were just not paying attention in that class or they just did not take it, because the way that I see a lot of Canadians act confused online, or they place their blame on the wrong level of government all the time. Like if you were having issues with your hydro bill being $1,000 and you're blaming the federal government, what are we talking about here? That is a provincial issue.
My heat and hydro now cost me more than my mortgage. A hydro bill, $1,085.
A number of them are provincial.
So you need to take that up with your MPP. Like we're constantly seeing people say like the rent prices are too high, which is true. And then they'll be like, Trudeau's government. Guess what, friend? That is not Trudeau's government's responsibility. That is the conservative provincial government that we have right now that has actively been cooking us with the cost of living. And yet they'll be saying under Trudeau's government, please, we need to know who to be placing our blame on so we'll know how to actually come together and advocate for these changes. The fact that you go to a hospital and end up waiting 12, 14 hours just to see a doctor, and you're like, the Trudeau government. Again, healthcare is not a federal responsibility. Obviously, they still oversee it, but the lack of funding that we're seeing right now is because your boy right now that's in office absolutely loves to pocket the money or just not put the money where it's supposed to go. And that includes increasing the wages, building more hospitals, and just making sure that the doctors that we do have left are not being overworked to the bone. Have you ever noticed, as Canadians, even though we have our own government, politics, and major issues, we don't nearly seem to be as interested in our own politics as our neighbors in the South are.
Clock that T. Clock that T.
Every time there's a US election, we all seem to be glued to our screen. When it comes to Canadian politics and Canadian elections, the excitement and the interest is just not there. In this video, I want to talk about why it is so important for us as Canadians to care about and to be involved in our own politics as well. First things first, let's break down some differences between Canadian politics and American politics. In Canada, we have three main levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal. The federal government oversees the country as a whole. It handles national defense, foreign policy, and big picture financial issues. Then there's the provincial government, which has powers over things like education, healthcare, and resource management. Finally, at the local level, municipalities handle city-specific services like transit, zoning, and local bylaws. In the US, there are also federal and state governments, but the structure is completely different. Each US state has its own extensive powers, which can sometimes overshadow the federal government's role in people's lives. This isn't as true in Canada, where federal authority is generally stronger, but provincial governments still have substantial influence over our daily lives. So how do we actually vote here in Canada? When Canadians go to the polls, especially at a provincial and federal level, we vote by choosing a candidate who represents a specific political party in our riding. The party that wins the most seats in the House of Commons for the federal election or in the provincial legislature forms the government. The party with the second most seats forms the official opposition. Our major difference with the US is that our prime minister is not directly elected. Canadians don't vote for the leader of our country directly. In America, you'll see on the ballots the different candidates that are running, but that is not the case here in Canada. Instead, we elect members of parliament, or MPs, and the leader of the party with the most seats becomes elected as prime minister. In the provincial election, it's the same, except we elect members of provincial parliament, or MPPs, and the party with the most MPPs elects the premier. Now, understanding who to blame or praise for different issues depends on which level of government is responsible for what. So as I said before, the federal government's responsibilities include national defense, international trade, immigration, and Indigenous relations. The provincial government is responsible for healthcare, education, transportation infrastructure, and energy policies. Municipal governments focus on local services like police, fire departments, water supply, and waste management. So with that being said, let's talk about the unfortunate voting habits in Canada. I'm going to particularly talk about Ontario because that is where I am based and that's where I'm from. voter turnout in Ontario has been garbage, absolutely dismal. It actually hit historic lows in the last provincial election. And yet, many people in Ontario are constantly complaining about issues that might have actually changed if they went out into the booths and if they voted. If we're not showing up to vote, then we are not using one of our biggest tools for change. I am never going to be that person that's like, "Ugh, I don't care about my vote. My vote doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anyways." You have to be an active citizen. If we actually want to see things progress and become better in this country and in this province, you have to vote. It is your duty to find a way, however possible, to send your vote in so that we can actually address these issues. It's honestly so painful because in 2022, Ontario had the opportunity to vote out Doug Ford, but so many people just did not show up to the polls. It's honestly incredibly frustrating to see people constantly talk about the problems taking place in Ontario. They could have impacted by just casting a vote.
Don't act shocked.
Again, we're talking about hospital wait times, education cuts, and the rising cost of housing. I know, unfortunately, there are a lot of conservative government glazers, so I actually want to dive into 4 specific issues and criticisms that I have and that many people have of the current Ford government. Point number 1, withholding $7.2 billion in funding. According to the Ontario Financial Accountability Office, Doug Ford's government is currently withholding $7.2 billion for healthcare. This money could have been invested in hospitals, community services, and transit, but instead it's sitting unused. And I genuinely wonder why. Critics, not me personally, so I don't want to get a lawsuit at my door, but critics argue that it's being redirected to benefit private interests instead of helping regular people in Ontario. I'm not the source for that, so don't sue me. But the critics are arguing, and I'm listening to the critics real good. Problem number 2 is Bill 124 and healthcare worker wages. As we saw, healthcare workers were literally hard carrying the entire province on their back during the pandemic. They were being overworked to the bone, absolutely burnt out, no protection, just put their lives on the line. For what exactly? Instead of supporting them, the Ford government introduced Bill 124, which caps wage increases for public sector workers, including nurses. This means that their wages are not keeping up with inflation, contributing to healthcare staff shortages and worker burnout. Thank you so much. So not only do we already have insanely high hospital wait times, which is unfortunately contributing to the deaths and untimely sicknesses of many people, but now the people that do work there are getting burnt out, are not being fairly compensated. We are the ones that are left to deal with it. Oh, I love to see that. I love to experience that. Thank you so much to our provincial government. Point number 3 is the one that I see a lot of people point their fingers at just the wrong level of government all the time. But this is about housing and the increased cost of housing prices and just overall lack of affordability. Ontario very clearly has a massive housing crisis, and it is only getting worse. Ford's government introduced a housing affordability task force, but the recommendations are just collecting dust. Instead of focusing on affordable housing, Ford recently vetoed a proposal for gentle intensification across neighborhoods, which honestly could have increased housing availability. Instead, he's choosing to not really do anything, despite the fact that Toronto is one of the most expensive cities in North America. Let's also not forget rent control, which has allowed landlords to basically charge $1 trillion for the smallest studio you've ever seen in your life, as long as the building was built after 2018. But this is the situation that we're in right now. And lastly, the mishandling of the pandemic and the long-term care home. Ontario's pandemic response, particularly in long-term homes, has been among the worst in Canada. Thousands of workers and residents in these facilities were infected with COVID-19, resulting in thousands of preventable deaths. Ontario was one of the last provinces to bring in paid sick leave, and even now, workers only get 3 days. If our current provincial government had prioritized public health, we might have had better outcomes. So you might be thinking, okay, so why does all of this matter? It's because government policies affect every aspect of our lives, from the quality of our healthcare and education to the availability of affordable housing. And yet, voter turnout remains low in Canada. If people in Canada truly want change, we need to show up and vote. It's honestly time we stop seeing politics as something distant and irrelevant. The reality is that our votes shape who make these crucial decisions. We literally cannot keep sitting back and then complaining when things don't go our way. So with that being said, I honestly think one of the main reasons why a lot of Canadians don't get involved in politics is because they just don't truly understand how our government works. But it's also the perception that one vote doesn't matter, but it does matter, no matter if it's a federal election, provincial, or municipal, especially where the outcome directly affects the critical services we rely on. If you want change, it starts with knowing the issues, knowing who's responsible, and making your voice heard at the polls. We can at least start there. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was informative. It's important for us to talk about our own politics as well and just get the ball rolling to hopefully encourage more people to become more active and be a more active citizen. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.